shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever.
Good morning. My name is Scott and Ken's oldest son. You can see why Ken is so proud of his grandchildren. They all did a great job. Thank you, Rob. Ken would have been 88 years old yesterday. Would have been his birthday. He lived a full life in that 88 years, I can assure you. He was most comfortable. The ceremony that you saw, he did many times. He would have liked to have been included in it today, not on this side. His childhood, he was born in Zephyr, Texas, 1924. The eldest of 4 children, himself and 3 younger sisters, and I can assure you that was quite a household. Knowing Ken and those girls, it was always a gotcha in there somewhere. He used to give us he had to walk to school 3 miles, and we go, yeah, we've heard that before, man. But he did. He truly had to walk about 3 miles to get to school. They literally had cows and chickens and chores. So Ken grew up with a lot of responsibility. And being the eldest and the only boy, I really pity him. But his family was involved in the Church of Christ, and his parents were strong believers. And I can honestly say he comes from good stock. All of his sisters have marvelous families, and I'm really proud that they were able to attend here today. I'd like to acknowledge that. High school, he graduated at age 17, Zephyr High School. All 14 kids in his class, and I used to kid him about, Dad, did you finish in the top 10? And I wasn't talking about 10%. You know what? He never would answer me. I'm not sure about that. He went on to Tarleton University, that's in Stephenville, for 2 years. I know he was involved in ROTC, and I don't know if he enrolled or if he was called up to military duty. I'm not really sure. But he was age 19. He was in the Army Air Corps, and where he did his training, I think it was Lackland. I'm not for sure, but I believe it was Lackland Air Force Base in San Antonio. Before he knew it, he ended up as a navigator stationed in Calcutta, India. They call it the CBI operation, China, Burma, India. And these men around, as you can imagine, quite a bit. We were at Barksdale Air Force Base, that's in Shreveport, for about 8 years. Dennis was flying the B-47, which was an intermediate to long-range bomber there. And I don't know much about the airplane, but I do know that one time he remarked that he had had over 11,000 hours in the cockpit of that particular aircraft. So, you know, that's a lot of flying time. And I failed to mention this, the B-24s, they flew in the CBI operation. This was kind of the infancy of this aircraft. It was a prototype airplane. It could carry a heavy load. It flew, you know, the excessive speed of about 300 miles an hour, so you can imagine how slow that was. Had 350 caliber machine guns mounted, one in the nose of the plane, one right behind the cockpit, and one in the tail. Well, you can imagine these pilots flying this aircraft with the radio chattering, 4 propellers, 1,200 horsepower propellers going, 50 caliber going off right behind their head. And a lot of these pilots wore, in those days, the Army Air Corps wore the Army issued helmet, which was a tin helmet, which only helped to reverberate that sound even more. So it was no wonder Ken was practically deaf by the end of his life. He truly did. Flying was an adventure in those days. And I talked to one of the men of the American Legion and understood that. And these guys were hardy, I tell you, really, really tough. A book recently came out, Unbroken, and it was about a war veteran shot down in a B-24. This man survived 2 years of captivity by the Japanese and 47 days at sea in Iraq. But the interesting part of the book was how crude and how dangerous the flying was in those days. This was by no means what we know today. These men were tough, and many a time, like I said, they would count bullet holes in the plane. We were in Barksdale for about 8 years, and we got transferred to a base, Del Rio, Texas. And I thought my father had been demoted. We got there, and there were very few aircraft. It was a small base. I didn't understand why we were there or what he did. We come to find out that the military had its most secret plane there, the U-2. It was always kept in a hangar. They landed and they took off at night. We were there a year, and Ken flew in South America, from what I understand. These were 12 to 17, 18-hour missions in a pressurized suit, flying 60 to 70,000 feet in the air. We just can hardly imagine. I mean, you're on the edge of outer space. You see the curvature of the Earth at that height. Funny thing was, it wasn't until years later that I even heard word to. Ken never talked about this stuff. He never talked about the missions. He never. And I don't, to this day, I really understand that. But I would like to read a quick excerpt from Tom Brokaw's book, The Greatest Generation. And it's not talking just about the military people, but about people of the World War II era. And I quote this, Mr. Brokaw says, "They came of age during the Great Depression and the Second World War and went on to build modern America. Men and women whose everyday lives of duty, honor, and achievement and courage gave us the world that we have today. America certainly owes that generation a debt of gratitude for literally saving the world." He goes on to quote, "This generation was united not only by a common purpose, but also by common values: duty, honor, economy, courage, service, love of family and country, and above all, responsibility for oneself." I thought that was very fitting, not only of Ken, because I saw a lot of attributes of that in Ken. Let me move on. He went from the bombers to the fighter planes after the Del Rio, and we started. We were a year in Lincoln, Nebraska, and he started flying the F-105, and that was a fighter aircraft. And then we were stationed in Okinawa. I spent 3 years of my high school career in the island of Okinawa. Well, the 3 years that we were there, Ken was gone at least a third of the time, probably even more than that, to Vietnam. And he was making bombing runs, or fighter runs. But he would come back from a mission. Sometimes the TDY would be for a couple of days. It might be exciting time. It was a very trying time in my life. After Okinawa, we came back to Texas. We came back to Abilene, where his parents had retired. I graduated from high school. 2 years later, my brother graduated from Abilene High, and my father retired in 1970. 27 years in the service. I'm not sure, but I think that the military had wanted to send him back to Vietnam on regular duty again. He had enough fighting. So he was ready to retire. They moved to Houston probably in the early 70s. It wasn't long they stayed in Abilene. And Kip got a real estate agency up in Texas, and he worked that for a few years. And then when he finally retired, he moved to La Porte. And he was very happy down here. He liked the small town. He liked being around people that he could talk with. And he was active in the Church of Christ. I know that. In conclusion, Ken was a good man. He loved his family. He was kind. He was certainly generous. Helpful to a fault. Somebody out with a flat tire kind of could be out there in a suit trying to help them. Pretty even tempered, except for the time he had a brand new fishing reel. Took my brother and I fishing. And my first cast, I snag his reel, and off it goes into the lake. Everything. That's one of the few times I actually heard his military voice. And I think I did a yes, sir. He just said, go get it. And that's the only time in my life I've ever opened my eyes underwater in a freshwater lake, and I found it. But rarely did he ever raise his voice. He was very even-tempered. But most importantly, Ken planted Christian seed for our brother and I to church. He made sure that we were exposed. And as I told the preacher, sometimes those seeds need a little more watering, and I know my brother and I did. But no, we had a great childhood. Ken, even though he did truly soar with the eagles, his feet were firmly planted on the ground. After he retired, I never heard anything about his military career. He never talked about it. He was most comfortable around these men that you just saw here. He'd much rather, have a conversation with them. I know he enjoyed living in La Porte, Texas. He enjoyed being active in his church. He certainly stayed active. There was a CBI group here, China, Burma, India, a fairly large group in the Houston area. And in 2006, we went to the Chinese embassy. And the Chinese embassy invited that group as a tribute for the men that fought against the Japanese in the war. And it was really it was a pretty fancy gig. We had a nice time, and you could tell the Chinese embassy was most grateful for the part that those men paid in the war. But there's a lot I could say, but I want to keep this fairly brief. To his family, he loved each and every one of them. To his church, thank you for being such an important part of his life. And to his comrades in